I'm Anton, and I'm a climatologist, and chances are you might be too. Climatologists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. Most importantly, they understand the central role that businesses can play in tackling the climate crisis. So if you too have pondered how we get to a future where clean, regenerative policy is embedded with profitable business models, the climatologist movement may just be for you. In this series, I'll be proving that climatologists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles. Stay with us, and if you like the episode, please subscribe and follow Climatologist on all socials. Enjoy. Tim, before we dive into the intricate world of carbon pricing and global trade, I'm sure our listeners would like to hear a little bit about your background. You've been deeply involved in the climate and finance world for some time now. Tell us a little bit about your journey, what led you to co-found your previous think tank in the US, and how did you end up launching climate energy finance here in Oz?
Thanks very much for having me. So I started my journey in finance. My passion, my vocation is finance. I worked for the biggest investment bank in the world, Citigroup at the time, and I was there for 17 years. But I realised my vocation and my expertise was in finance, but obviously you also want to do something worthwhile for the world, and finance is very, very self-centred, very money-oriented. So I thought, how do I use my skill set, which is finance, for a positive purpose? So I started co-founded a think tank called IEFA, an American think tank, 12 years ago, and worked there for a decade. And then I wanted to actually just come back and work mainly on Australia and not have the international complexities of an American based organisation. So I founded Climate Energy Finance in January 2022, supported by Australian philanthropy. And originally I'd spent a lot of time working on China 10 or 15 years ago. I thought 10 years ago maybe the world's cottoned on that China's winning the global technology race to decarbonisation. So I pivoted my focus to India, because if we can't solve for China and India, we're not going to solve the global crisis. India has a lot of promise, and Prime Minister Modi has shown a lot of vision there. It was also coincidental I was working on the Stop Adani campaign, providing financial advice to the environmentalists working on that. But now Climate Energy Finance, we've sort of pivoted back to China, because I think we need optimism. We need to understand we can actually solve the global climate crisis. And to me, China is just moving so much further and faster and more aggressive and more ambitious than anyone in the world really realises. I sort of came to that conclusion 15 years ago, but 15 years later, people still underestimate how all in China is on this. And ultimately, they are winning the race. They are going to help solve the climate crisis. And they're also Australia's number one trade partner. So if we're going to change the politics in Australia, we've really got to actually collaborate with Asian countries led by China, then Korea, Japan and India, rather than focusing on our historic past of the Anglo world.
So obviously the Chinese see an immense opportunity in climate. Is that the reason that you mentioned wanting to do something good for the world? Was the opportunity of it as well something interesting?
I'm always looking for disruption. At the end of the day, financial analysts, like I was a finance analyst at Citi for 20 years, you study companies and sectors, and an analyst's job's really easy until you get it really badly wrong. Like you just extrapolate. You extrapolate a growth rate. You say, is it going to accelerate or is it going to slowly decline the rate of growth? But most industries are pretty standard. Where you get absolutely blown out of left field is when you hit tipping points. And tipping points means you're going from upwards to collapsing, and companies go bankrupt in that process. And that's where investors lose a lot of money. So, sorry, that might sound a little strange, but China has created a tipping point in global technologies relating to zero emissions. They are scaling it up. They're investing massively in technology. And so the world is at a tipping point. We're at a climate tipping point, but we're also at a technology and investment tipping point. And so it's actually being able to understand that sort of I had the privilege of investing in China 15 years ago, and I could see what they were trying to do, and they were actually pretty open about it. You could talk to the CEOs there and see what they were aiming for 15 years later, they've delivered on more than the expectations that they were setting themselves 15 years ago. But I don't think enough people watch what China's doing.
It's fascinating. Coming from a technology background, I saw this change. Well, I wasn't actually in the tech sector when the first wave of inflection happened in the technology sector. It feels like this is that same sort of first massive wave of change, but on a much bigger scale, because it's hitting the industrial sector.
Yeah, I'm quite a bit older than you. I was around when the internet first came around, so 1990, and I remember we were just all in on it, and then all of a sudden we went over the valley of death, and the companies all went bankrupt, and we were valuing things on eyeballs. I mean, it was absolutely stupid, like enterprise value per eyeball, per visual impact. No, that saying went out the door because it was really bloody stupid, but the concepts a decade later, once they got through the valley of death, every disruption that we were looking at in 1990 happened. It just happened. It took a decade longer for the technologies to commercialise and the models to become valid, but the disruption was there. So you're right, the internet, we just take it for granted now, but 30 years ago, it was totally disruption.
Massive.
That's what we're going through now.
Massive system change. So let's pivot a little bit. Think tank. So what is a think tank? How do they work? I've always been interested.
Yeah, it's self-titled. There is no formal definition, but I run a small public interest think tank. We actually do a lot of thinking. We do a lot of reading of what's happening globally. So our logic is that finance has got more than enough capacity to solve the crisis, the climate crisis, so long as we actually get money at scale. So we analyse what's happening in the energy system, and then we publish financial research on the back of trends, and we do independent analysis. We're funded by philanthropy. That's the real difference between, we are a lobbyist, we are a public interest lobbyist, and that's where we're funded by philanthropy to lobby on behalf of the environment and the people of Australia. In our definition, no one's telling us what to write, but the difference is when our funders are not going to receive a financial benefit if we win the argument, if we get policy change. So at the end of the day, it's trying to provide financial analysis and global analysis on energy transition, disruption, and what does it mean for Australia. And so, philanthropic funded, and that's the key thing. Our funders have no vested interest other than they all believe we need a livable planet and we need to solve the climate crisis.
Got it. So you mentioned policymakers. Who else are the audience for the papers that you produce, or the research that you produce?
Yeah, my research is very much tailored to the financial market. So environmentalists usually are there to protect the environment, and they're there to try and get the government to protect and stand up for, because the environment doesn't have a voice. So my voice is more focused on the financial markets, and at the end of the day, that shows my bias and my skill set. Finance is phenomenally powerful. It just needs to actually understand that money can be made or lost if they actually follow what the science is doing. But where we have pivoted our focus is, at the end of the day, finance without a price signal can't actually solve the climate crisis. So you actually need to influence the regulators and the government to create the right market signal and then get out of the way and let the financial market solve. So a key point I would make is that there is more than enough money in the world to solve the climate crisis. The International Energy Agency says we need maybe $4 to $6 trillion a year invested in clean tech. This year we'll hit $2 trillion. So
that's fantastic.
It's a huge improvement. It's up from $1 trillion a decade ago. The world spends about $1 trillion a year on fossil fuels. So all up, we're spending about $3 trillion. What we need to do is take the $1 trillion we're spending on fossil fuels and put it into zero emission solutions, and then double down and maybe go 20, 30, 40% more, 50% more, because we've got a climate crisis. But the money's there, but without the right price signal, you can't actually mobilise at the speed and scale the science dictates. So I totally acknowledge we've got a climate crisis, and the scientists have been proven to be too conservative. But on the other hand, technology is amazing, and capital markets are I mean, in my view, unstoppable once you get the right signal in place.
So what does that signal do? How does it? So we're talking about specifically a price on carbon. What does it do to the financial markets?
Yeah, maybe if we were talking earlier about technology. If we think about electric vehicles, I'm absolutely adamant. Electric vehicles have now won the race. I've just come back from China. I've just gone and looked at a whole lot of Chinese EV world leaders, and invariably consumers are now going to choose EVs because the technology is so much superior than an internal combustion engine. Now, that means you don't need the price signal because consumers will just buy the better product. Pound for pound, an EV is better. And the range anxiety, like BYD's just announced a hybrid with 2,000 kilometres range, right? Forget range anxiety, it's gone. BYD's also launched the new Blade technology, battery technology, which means that the cars won't catch on fire even in an accident. The battery can't burn. Now, that's an EV revolution because people worry about safety and they worry about range. Well, take those two out and now you're getting a better product. So that's a long path. Now, cars are very much a consumer product, so the consumer chooses. In energy markets, it's about lowest cost. So we all use electricity. We don't know where the electricity is coming from, whether it's coal power, gas power, or whether it's renewables. At the end of the day, you need to level that playing field. A price on carbon pushes the price of coal-fired power plants up, pushes the price of methane gas power plants, and therefore it levels the playing field, internalises the cost into the system, and then let the best technology then win. And in my view, there is no risk. Wind and solar, firmed by batteries, firmed by pumped hydro, firmed by technology, will be the best solution, the lowest cost solution. But it needs a price on carbon to actually drive the signal, because the consumer isn't going to pay more necessarily, or a lot more, for a cleaner product. Unfortunately, the average person has plenty of priorities, and cost of living is probably the top priority in Australia right now. Thinking about solving the climate crisis is a little beyond most people. It might be my passion, your passion, but for the average person who's just trying to feed their family, educate their family and pay the rent, climate's sort of leave that to the government. So if you leave it to the government, then the government's actually got to have a right mandate. They put a price on carbon, then leave it to the financial markets, and then we solve the problem.
So practically playing out, we put a price on carbon, which is basically you emit, you pay. You emit CO2 or methane or something else, you pay. How does that play out? Give me a couple of examples of how that might play out.
It's a really basic economic model. Polluter pays. User pays, polluter pays. If you want to use fossil fuels, go ahead, but you're going to pay a price for it because you're going to impact the environment. You're going to externalise your pollution onto the environment and to everyone else in the economy, both in Australia and globally. So polluter pays is a standard economic model. Now, where this breaks down, the climate crisis breaks down, is a point that was made about the tragedy of the horizons and the tragedy of the commons. So it was a phrase that came, Mark Carney. At the time, Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England. He was also the chair of the Financial Stability Board. 2015, he wrote a paper called The Tragedy of the Horizon. So if we go and pollute our environment today, it's got global ramifications in 5, 10, 50, 100 years now, but 100 years from now. But it also has global significance. So the implications of polluting today implications stick around for 50 or 100 years. So that's the tragedy of the horizon. We put a price on carbon. That means the consumer then has a choice. Do they want to use a high pollution product or a low pollution product? And they pay the price. And the price has to be the cleanup cost. Now, that also then levels the playing field. So we actually have zero emissions solutions. That's the beauty of solar. That's the beauty of EVs. That's the beauty of batteries. But at the moment, they're higher priced than fossil fuel alternatives. You put a price on carbon, it raises the price of the oil or gas or coal that you're using, and therefore consumers will then pivot to the cheaper option.
So household energy, cars, any other examples? Obvious examples?
There are the industry, and so you mentioned the safeguard mechanism. It's the safeguard mechanism is a tax on the carbon emissions or carbon pollution of the 219 biggest carbon and greenhouse gas emissions facilities in Australia. And so it's not across the whole economy, it's just on the biggest facilities, the biggest causes of the problem outside of the electricity system. You decarbonise electricity, you decarbonise heavy industry. Consumers use electricity, they use oil for their cars, so the transport sector is the other big sector. You use EVs, you decarbonise your electricity, all of a sudden you've dealt with industry, you've dealt with electricity, and you've dealt with transport. So that's what we're aiming to do to solve the wider economy, and then we start working on the really hard stuff, which is plastics, chemicals, and steel and cement and stuff like that.
Got it. So the safeguard mechanism applies to Australia's, is it 200 biggest emitters?
219 biggest facilities. So some of them, like Rio, might have 2 or 3 or 4 of those facilities. So it's not 219 companies, it's 219 facilities.
And the safeguard mechanism ratchets the price up or their emissions capability down?
So it starts with you're given free permits for 100% of your pollution if you're a standard industry player. So that was 2023. On average, it had no impact, but it means the high emissions companies are paying the tax and the low emissions players in the peer group get a benefit. But then as a key point you said is it ratchets down. So the amount of free permits goes down by 4.9% per annum per facility. We'll leave some complexities out of that, but that means over a 2030, that means you get a 35% reduction on average in industry emissions from those 219 facilities. So 4.9% in 1 year is not a big deal, but 35% in 6 years is, and so it puts industry on a path to decarbonisation.
So how does it decarbonise? You've got established facilities, they've got particular ways of working. How do they decarbonise?
Yeah, it's complex. It puts the onus back on the facility owner. Like one option is you shut the facility down. Now, if the coal mine just happens to be the biggest methane emitter in Australia, if we close just one, we could reduce our emissions by 10 or 15% in all of the safeguard facilities if we measured it properly. So that will be the extreme. Take the worst polluter and close it down. The better option is to actually then decarbonise through electrification, for example. So most mines in Australia are run on diesel, imported diesel. Diesel is really expensive by the time you've imported it and then got it to outback Australia. It's also really high emissions, and worse, we subsidise it as a country. The government provides a massive diesel subsidy. So if you were to electrify your mine site and you were to electrify your haulage vehicles, your mining equipment, then all of a sudden you reduce your emissions dramatically because you're no longer using diesel. So you could do that overnight. You could close the mine down, you could electrify everything and then and power it with renewable energy, but that would be a massive upfront investment. So the safeguard mechanism is about saying, okay, you've got 10 mine sites and you need to progressively decarbonise all of them, 5% per year. What you might do is say, well, we will do one mine site entirely, or we'll do incremental grows and it'll take 10 years to do the whole 10 mine sites and we'll do it all concurrently or whatever. But at the end of the day, you get to pick and choose as the company. You can pay the tax, you can buy offsets, or you can just put things on a decarbonisation process. But at the end of the day, it's making the company progressively take responsibility for their pollution.
The Australian government is working on and has done some reform of the way that carbon credits are certified here. And in fact, my first guest on the podcast was Andrew Grant, who who works in carbon offsets. His view is that there is a pretty rigorous framework for certification here in Australia for offsets.
Yeah, we need the offsets. Because we're not just going to, like people go, but if we, like people like Senator Canavan, if we turned the coal plants off tomorrow, then the lights would go off. Well, yes, they would. If we stopped importing oil, we'd stop being able to drive. We can't transition our economy today, overnight. It is going to take a decade. It won't take 30 years. It'll take 1 decade, but the science says we've only got a decade. If they're regulated well, independently, if you don't have regulatory capture, if you have a government with a clear mandate, then offsets could work beautifully. They can be a key part of the solution, but you use the word reduce. So we need to avoid, reduce, recycle, and ultimately offset. It's the sort of last resort, and to clean up the stuff that's hard to do.
So let's pivot now to Europe. So Europe has had a carbon price for a while. How has that played out for the European market?
So Europe has led the world on developing emissions trading schemes. So 20 odd years ago, Europe has put in place a system starting with the electricity sector. That's the easiest sector to reduce emissions in, and then progressively widening out to cover all heavy industry. But it's been a 20-year investment, and for the first 15 years, they massively gamed it. The fossil fuel industry is very powerful in Europe, or was very powerful in Europe. It's still very powerful in Australia, America, and Europe, and the rest of the world. But in Europe, they provided free offsets and effectively bribed the fossil fuel industry to say, look, accept it'll have no impact in this decade. And so for the first decade, it had no impact, but they got in place the system. And so over the last 5 to 10 years, the EU ETS, Emissions Trading Scheme, has gone from 20 euros a tonne. It got up to 100 euros a tonne about 2 years ago. It's now down 60, 70 euros a tonne. So the Emissions Trading Scheme in Europe is a world leader, and it has progressively, over 20 years, had a serious impact on decarbonising the European economy.
So outside of exporters who are exporting to the European market, what other macro impacts might the European CBAM have? So I know in the technology context, when Europe moved on privacy, the GDPR, privacy washed through the world. Do you think something similar will happen with the CBAM?
I am hopeful that it will, and it's about a mindset change. So in China, at the end of the day, we need China to solve the climate crisis. They're the biggest emitter today. They're not historically, but today they are the biggest emitter. But they're also the second most powerful country, and they're the biggest investor by a country mile in clean tech. I'm a China bull, unashamedly. I've just come back from China. It's staggering what they are doing. But when you talk about Australia's implications from the CBAM is immaterial. Like, all of our exports, 30% of them go to China, 10% go to Japan, 10% go to Korea, 10% go to America, and then India. So we export very little to Europe. So the direct implications of the EU CBAM on Australia, immaterial. It becomes catastrophic if we ignore the climate science and ignore the signal and leadership Europe's doing if China were to join the EU CBAM and to have a Chinese CBAM or a North Asian CBAM.
So why would China think about a CBAM?
China exports a lot to Europe, and they do a lot of manufacturing. So China has been the manufacturing hub of the world for decades. So when Europe puts a trade barrier on carbon, China is fundamentally threatened by that tax. So it's not the tax impact for Australia, it's the fact that China is 30% of Australian exports, and if China starts to deal in response to the EU ETS and the EU CBAM, if China starts to deal with it, then Australia is directly impacted very fundamentally. Why would China respond? China is, in my view, the absolute world leader when it comes to investing in zero emissions technologies and industries of the future. They're not doing it necessarily just to solve the climate crisis. They're very strategic. China wants to beat America. They want to be the world's number one economy. So they've realised that America is a petrostate and that China is the importer of fossil fuels. They don't have a big fossil fuel industry of their own. But what they're also doing is saying they don't want to rely on Western imports and Middle East imports of fossil fuels, Australian imports of fossil fuels. So they've seized the strategic high ground by saying we want to dominate all of these industries of the future. We want to decarbonise steel. We want to decarbonise transport. We want to decarbonise electricity. And that's what they're doing. And so they've built up, they're the world's number one manufacturer of solar modules, right? 80% global market share, 90% global market share, just unprecedented dominance of a global industry. But they're also the number one installer of solar. In the last 12 months, they installed 55-60% of the world's solar modules in their own economy. They're the world's number one manufacturer of wind turbines, but they also the number one installer of wind turbines. They did something like 60% of the world's installations of wind turbines. Electric vehicles, they're now the number one manufacturer of electric vehicles, but they're also selling in the domestic economy 60% of the world's EVs last year. So they dominate the EV industry, but to do an EV, you need a battery. So they also dominate the world's battery manufacturing, and they dominate solar and wind and hydro and nuclear and grid transmission and smart meters and electrolyzers, green hydrogen electrolyzers, and all the technologies that go with that. So the leader of China has realized that dominating these zero emissions industries of the future means China can dominate the world's economy. They can be the manufacturing hub of the world, and all these industries are structural growth industries. So China's backing a winner, but China is now the world's number one exporter of solar modules. They're the world's number one exporter of wind turbines. They're the world's number one exporter of EVs or cars, full stop, not just EVs. They overtook Japan last year to be the world's number one exporter of cars. They overtook Germany 2 years ago. Now they've overtaken Japan. Why? Because they've gone all in on electric vehicles, and Japan is having a two-way bet because they dominate the internal combustion engine. There's a thing called the Kodak moment. The last person to realise you are dead man walking is the CEO of the company that is the incumbent when there's a technology disruption. And so Toyota is dead man walking. Ford and GM, dead man walking. They don't understand that there's a disruption coming. The Chinese have already won the race. And so now what they're doing is getting the American government to actually put up massive trade barriers because they can't compete against EVs coming from China.
It's interesting. There's some interesting movements happening in the US around this with the Inflation Reduction Act, and Europe is doing other things to try and build up this industry. And it's not the subject of the podcast, but do you think those efforts will play out?
Yeah. The Inflation Reduction Act is President Biden's response to China's global dominance of all these industries. And it's a pretty audacious, I was going to say ambitious, it's phenomenally ambitious, it's audacious. America, the land of the free markets, and the government threw $1 trillion of subsidies on the table. Nothing like $1 trillion of subsidies to kickstart private enterprise. And the don't underestimate American capitalism. When you throw $1 trillion of carrots on the floor, then industry has just gone all in on it. So it's Biden and America's attempt to get back in the global race. Now, at the end of the day, we need a global race. This is a global catastrophe. The climate science is real. We have to deal with it. We've got to deal with it at a massive scale, faster than we're dealing with it today. So nothing like having a global race to the top. So Europe's response to China has been to invest heavily, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies for green industries. They've got a carbon price. America's response, the IRA, $1 trillion. So we actually do have a race to the top. Japan, Korea are involved because Japan and Korea are key trade and strategic partners to America. And so where China's locked out of America, that gives Japan and Korea a massive opportunity to get into the race. India, for geopolitical reasons, put up barriers to China. Now India's in the race to decarbonise. Why? Because they're one of the largest importers of fossil fuels in the world. They see decarbonisation as a way to build energy security. Europe's in the race already. So now you've got a global race to the top. So it's great. At the end of the day, we need someone to win. We need the best technologies in the world, and we need them yesterday. And so ultimately, it gives me a lot of optimism. Because don't underestimate the American economy.
So you've got a lot of push, I suppose. Well, it's driven by government incentive, but a lot of push from industry now for global decarbonisation because these industries are going to want customers. They're going to want the transition to happen faster. Great. Let's pivot back to the CBAM. So Chinese CBAM let's say the Chinese put in a carbon border adjustment mechanism, what exports of Australia would be impacted, and what would they be compensating for in terms of what would the Chinese be compensating for in terms of their exports to Europe?
So China does have a national ETS. I skipped over that, but they 3 years ago introduced a national ETS on electricity. By volume, it's 4 times bigger than the European ETS. So China does have a price on carbon. Last month, the Chinese government ratcheted up the ETS, and the price of carbon's gone from $8 to 12. China's not doing it tomorrow. The price on carbon is not the central mechanism, but they do have a emissions trading scheme. They have said maybe by next year, 8 big industries of China will have the emissions trading scheme in place. At the moment, it's just electricity. Now, Australia supplies thermal coal and LNG to China, but we supply a huge amount of coking coal and a huge amount of iron ore to the steel industry. So if you think about the global carbon challenge, Chinese steel sector emissions are just staggering. They're 1.8 billion tonnes a year. What all of that introduces is that if China wants to export lower emissions steel, and the Chinese steel industry is the highest emission steel industry in the world, they're half the world's steel industry, just as Australia is half the world's iron ore and we're half the world's coking coal, China and Australia are trade allies. China is 30% of Australia's exports. So if China needs to decarbonise steel, they can pivot to electric arc furnaces, or they can try and reduce the emissions of their iron ore. At the end of the day, they've already built the blast furnaces, so over time they will pivot to electric arc, but for now they're using blast furnaces. So what they need to do is actually reduce the emissions of their iron ore. So iron ore is literally iron and oxygen. Australia exports the iron ore unprocessed. We dig and ship. If China were to put a price on carbon emissions, what they could do is buy iron from Australia. So there's a process called HBI, hot briquetted iron, or green iron. Green iron's the holy grail. It doesn't exist anywhere commercially today, but green iron is using renewable energy to break the bonds of oxygen and iron. And so you take your iron ore, you break the bonds, get rid of the oxygen, and you export just the iron. HBI uses methane as a process, a chemical heat and an energy source. So HBI is half the emissions would halve the emissions of the Chinese steel industry. Green iron would reduce them by 70 or 80%.
Wow. So absent the carbon price, or absent a global carbon price, in anticipation of these changes, are any other companies, major Australian businesses, making strides in this direction?
Yeah, Fortescue has been beating the drum very, very vocally. Twiggy Forrest, a very divisive character, but he has thrown $6 billion US dollars commitments on the table, but he's done it in a divisive way. What we need to do is rethink capitalism. I know it maybe sounds rather high-minded, but at the end of the day, we've got a global crisis, a climate crisis. If we had a price on carbon, it'd be easy. We need to get the consensus to get a price on carbon, and then we need to move this decade at speed and scale, unprecedented. So if you think Dr. Saul Griffiths talks about we need a war footing type thinking, but we do need to think differently about capitalism, because China, as I've just said, dominates the world. They're a command and control economy. Leaving it to a free market without a price signal is banking on losing. So what I would be thinking, and this gets back to what Twiggy Forrest is doing, he has been leading the charge, banging the drum, investing aggressively in technologies that aren't yet commercially proven. We actually need the Australian industry to collaborate. They need to collaborate with each other, and they need to collaborate with their customers. So let me give you a step back. BHP 30 years ago did HBI, hot briquetted iron, in the Pilbara, and the WA government gave them access to a whole lot of public iron ore assets. They said, so long as you do value added in Australia before you export. So we've got a climate crisis. We've got a $125 billion a year export opportunity by valuing embodied decarbonisation in our green iron before we export it. We need BHP, Rio, Fortescue, and even Hancock Prospecting to work together, to collaborate, And that will get the technology readiness up. That'll get the scale. We do have some issues, like the Pilbara is a very expensive place to work. We need to actually make the right foundations. We've got to overcome some pretty serious system inertia, but we also need to work with our customers. So again, we're talking collaboration. Financial markets aren't very good at collaborating. Free markets aren't good at collaboration. They're about competition. But at the end of the day, we need collaboration. So we need Australia to collaborate with China.
Final question. In the landscape of that change, that intervention, what is a major opportunity you feel Australian business, maybe a step down from the Rios and the BHPs, is leaving on the table? They haven't sort of jumped on the wagon. Yeah,
Australia has a lot of ingenuity, and I think we underestimate it. We've got complacent, and we also, we're a high labour cost, we're too far away from it, lots of negativity. So we've got to think about Australia leveraging our strategic opportunities and thinking we can actually collaborate, partner and play to win and back Australian ingenuity.
So anything that looks to demand side as a result of the supply side shifts that are happening in energy is a big opportunity, sounds like.
Technology, Australia can play world leading in technology, science, collaborating. China, Japan, Korea need collaboration. There's plenty of opportunity for Australia, and at the end of the day, we need to invest, I don't know, 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion in building out wind, solar and batteries and grid in Australia. That's a $300 billion investment opportunity in Australia. That's not in China, that's in Australia. It's our wind, our solar, our batteries, our grid that will power the green iron that we export. There's a huge amount of learning by doing. We need to overcome the fear and the negativity, and we need to actually sell a story that Australia can be a huge beneficiary of it. And then we need to convince Middle Australia that this isn't a wrecking ball, and Australia be one of the biggest beneficiaries of the world decarbonisation, literally one of the biggest beneficiaries in embodying decarbonisation and rebuilding our economy.
Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Once again, if you like listening today, then please subscribe to The Climatalist wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a follow on Instagram, where we're just Climatalist. I'm Anton. Thanks for listening.